And how does the European-American equation work there vis-a-vis Ukraine?
Well, I mean, it depends who wins the US presidential election, but I think oddly, there's not as much distance between Trump and the Democrats as one thinks, because I think both of them think there should be a peace conference next year, that Ukraine is not going to win, and that you should have a kind of freeze in place of the current fighting lines, that Russia will take what it's taken, that the West won't acknowledge that formally, in the same way as the West never actually formally acknowledged Russian,
Crimea.
yeah, or even Russian sovereignty of the Baltic states in the Cold War. You know, but it was just de facto
Yes.
part of the Soviet Union. Um, but then I think the really big difference between the Democrats and the Republicans is not so much that how to end the war, but what happens afterwards. I think the Democrats and the European Union certainly take the idea of security guarantees for Ukraine very seriously and would like Ukraine to be a viable state. So they think if they can freeze the lines more or less where they are now, Ukraine is left with a working port in Odessa, most of its agricultural land, most of its industry. Then you can pour aid in, and then you've just got to somehow stop the situation that the Ukrainians are warning about, which is that Russia maybe pauses for 3 years, but rearms and then comes straight back at them. So that's where you get into security guarantees. And should we let them into NATO? And if we don't let them into NATO, is there some other form of credible security guarantee? And that's real debate. I think Trump basically couldn't care less about that. Would be my guess. He certainly wouldn't put American troops on the ground, and he's pretty ambivalent about NATO as it is. The idea that he would extend NATO to Ukraine, I think, forget about it. That's not going to happen. And that, I think, is why the Russians would like him, because I think he'd not only give them a possible victory, he'd also essentially forget about Ukraine. And so the Ukraine would be in the danger of being Afghanistan or Vietnam, where there's a peace declared, and then a couple of years later it all collapses.